Archaeology News, the news you can trust.
All right, for today's archaeology news, we are headed to North Africa, a region we've not covered very much on this channel. First, we'll go with a feel-good ancient DNA story, since those we've covered recently have generated some controversy and devolved into Twitter catfights. So we're trying to avoid that here, and we'll focus on the region of Maghreb, which encompasses the present-day nations of Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. And one thing that has always puzzled archaeologists is a big split between Western and Eastern Maghreb in prehistoric times. You see, hunter-gatherer and then pastoral lifestyle hung on in Eastern Maghreb until the first millennium BC, when settled farming finally arrived, whereas in the Western Maghreb, it took hold thousands of years earlier. And this tale begins with, well, bones, because that's where we get DNA. The bones of 9 individuals, to be exact, and they lived in the Eastern Maghreb between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. And what the DNA analysis showed was that, unlike samples taken from the Western Maghreb, which reflected an 80% contribution from a population known as European farmers, those from the East reflected more of the pre-existing population of the region, as well as some contribution from the Levant. And DNA analysis of these remains from Eastern Maghreb showed something fascinating. One individual at Jebba in present-day Tunisia, who lived about 8,500 years ago, had about 6% of his DNA traceable to European hunter-gatherers, a population distinct from European farmers. I know what you're thinking. Big deal, right? What's 6%? Well, there was another contemporaneous site included in the sample called Hergla, where they found obsidian.
Dragon glass.
Dragon glass?
The maesters call it obsidian.
This is important because that dragon glass came from Pantelleria, an island between Sicily and Tunisia. And we already thought people at this time could travel to some extent by sea, because just last year in 2024, hollowed-out wood canoes found not too far away in Bracciano Lake in central Italy were dated to around 7,500 years ago. And this should be a surprise to no one, because remember, there is already a strong suspicion that early hominins traveled between North Africa and Europe via the Strait of Gibraltar more than 1 million years ago, which we covered on this channel. So not totally surprising that people 7,000 or 8,000 years ago could do the same. So the bottom line is this population in Eastern Maghreb was not totally isolated, yet remained genetically distinct from its neighbors, and it held on to its hunter-gatherer and pastoral lifestyle while the neighbors were adopting farming. Why? Why, you ask? Well, quite simply, they were successful. Their lifestyle worked for them.
And as I always say, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Now, why is this a feel-good story? Why didn't it cause loads of controversy, even though it involved some of the usual suspects and was done in David Reich's lab, which has attracted a lot of controversy over the years? Well, quite simply because they were making inferences relating the DNA findings with the material remains found directly with them or in the area. The human remains, the canoes, and the obsidian. And the claims they were making were relatively modest about people in a relatively circumscribed geographical area around the archaeological sites. Now, I personally kind of wish they had more DNA samples. 9 spread out over some thousands of years is not actually a lot. But then again, the claims they're making are not some broad sweeping statements. They're talking about the people at this time right in this area. So, while I would like to see a little bit more DNA evidence to beef these claims up, the paper was not sweeping enough to cause a Twitter war. And that's why this was a feel-good DNA story. As for the next story, we're staying in the neighborhood, in the Maghreb, but we're going west to a site called Kashkoush in present-day Morocco. And yes, trolls, I got that pronunciation from an Arab speaker, so spare me the smarmy comments. And this site had been excavated long ago in the 1990s, revealing an 8th to 6th century BC Phoenician settlement, which was not exactly a surprise. You see, the Phoenicians were an ancient Semitic-speaking people from the Levant. Now, Semitic languages comprise many from the Middle East, some of which survive today. Most commonly known are Arabic, Hebrew, and Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. And these Phoenicians traveled far and wide throughout the Mediterranean and probably even beyond all the way to Britain. Their trade empire was at its peak between 1200 and 800 BC when they had settlements all over the Mediterranean. Now, I can talk all day about the Phoenicians because they were a complex multi-ethnic society way before that was a cool thing. Anyway, they were eventually absorbed into various other cultures, but the point is they were the first to reach the Western Maghreb in about 800 BC. Wrong! Well, that certainly seems to be the case based on more recent excavations at Kashkus, starting in 2021, when a multinational team, mostly from Spain and Morocco, decided to dig a little deeper, literally. And what they found, to use a cliche, literally rewrote the history of the region.
You say literally one more time and I'm gonna hang up.
Yes, I know that expression is overplayed, but in this case it's kinda true. You see, the team conducted more extensive digs, and beneath the Phoenician building footprints they found the remnants of older buildings. How old? Well, the radiocarbon dating showed 3 phases. The Phoenician phase from around 800 to 400 BC, and 2 earlier phases. One of these was from 1200 to 900 BC, and a much earlier one, as early as 2200 BC. And if you notice that last and oldest one, it comes from a single sample of cattle bone. Now, the team expects more extensive remnants from that earlier time to come up once they get around to digging deeper. As you can see, they just barely got into that stratigraphic layer. However, as you saw, that middle phase, dating from 1200 to 900 BC, did have quite a few radiocarbon dating samples, namely seeds and bones. And in terms of anthropogenic or human-made artifacts, that middle phase looked very different from the Phoenician one, as evidenced by several categories of finds. See for yourself. There was pottery, there were tools, and there was worked stone. So it was clear that people lived there before the Phoenicians, and their culture looked very different from the Phoenicians, as evidenced by the building structures and artifacts. Now, one thing they did not find at this site, or at least they omitted it from the publication if they did, were human remains. But based on what we saw in our feel-good DNA story just before, these folks in Western Maghreb should have had DNA that looked quite different from those of the Phoenicians, who hailed from the Levant. But this study of Kashkus is enough for us to say pretty definitively that the Western Maghreb had not been deserted, or at least not for long, when the Phoenicians arrived in the Iron Age. What this site shows is that a successful community had flourished there. Based on the seeds, we know they grew barley, wheat, beans, and peas. And with more than 8,000 animal bones found in just a relatively small excavation area, we know they had plenty of animals. So this was not some poor backwater, but home to a prosperous folk, and proof that the roots of civilization in North Africa did not begin with the Phoenicians. Anyway, the ending was not sad either. The site was abandoned probably around 600 BC as the sea trade ramped up and trade routes probably shifted towards the coast. So as usual, the people followed the money. In other words, no sign of violence, no burnt buildings, weapons, or butchered humans. But it was abandoned and until recently, lost to time. Well, that'll do it for our feel-good episode of Archaeology News. Thanks for watching. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.